Hello everyone! I have a surprising and very amusing story to tell you, the story of the knight that goes to a3. Let me explain. In the game, Grandmaster Christian Bauer starts with e4 and his opponent plays c5, the Sicilian defense, and that's when Christian Bauer plays knight to a3. Now this is quite a surprising move, because we always tell beginners to centralize their knights, to put them on c3 and f3 towards the center. But here Christian Bauer places it on a3, and it's not just for show. Not at all, on the contrary, he has very specific ideas with this knight on a3. But first, let's talk about the context of this game. This game is being played in round 1 of the Plagne tournament. It's a very friendly, welcoming French tournament, a Masters tournament, but also open to amateur players. And once again this year, I will be covering the Plagne tournament. That means every day I will present to you the game of the day, the most interesting game. And for this first game, I have selected this knight to a 3 move by Christian Bauer. So why knight to a 3? Well, it's often said that a knight on the edge isn't a good square, because it loses mobility. But a knight on the edge can still be interesting if it has potential, if it's able to come back into the position. And the knight on a 3 can return in several ways. Sometimes it can make use of the b5 square to try to attack, but in the end that's quite rare. Most of the time, in this position, the knight will try to recenter itself on c4. And from the c4 square, it can hide the b6 and d6 squares and put pressure on the e5 square with the help of the other knight. But if the knight on a 3 is not able to make use of the b5 or c4 squares because the opponent, for example, quickly plays a 6 followed by b5, well, the knight can just as well support the d4 push. With c3, the knight can return to c2 and we will support the d4 push. And in this game, the knight on a 3 will actually turn out to be decisive, with a myriad of possibilities that I invite you to follow. Christian Bauer's opponent plays knight to c6 and now bishop to b5. This is interesting because it's a bit like in the Rossolimo variation, where the bishop is exchanged for the knight to change the material balance not, only will we have different pieces. But the pawn structure will also be altered. Black plays g6, and so here there is this exchange of bishop for knight. So it's interesting how Christian Bauer plays, because he puts this knight on the edge and then quickly develops his bishop to exchange it for the knight. So he's going to use 2 bishop moves to exchange it for a knight that has only moved once, and on top of that he gives up the bishop pair. So for a classical player, it's quite strange, it's rather disconcerting, yet there is logic to it. After bishop takes on c6, black will worsen their pawn structure when recapturing on c6. Now, one could advise black to recapture with the b-pawn on c6 to take towards the center. But recapturing with the d-pawn on c6 is also very interesting and often played, because it directly opens the diagonal for the light-squared bishop. Now, black is the only one with the light-squared bishop, so it's natural for them to try to bring it into play. And it also opens the semi-open d-file for the queen, as well as control over the d4 square, which can be further strengthened by fianchettoing the bishop to g7. And so, for this reason, black decided to recapture with the d7 pawn on c6. So Christian Bauer plays d3, bishop to g7, and here he plays f4. This move f4 is interesting because one might think that advancing the f-pawn could weaken the shelter around the white king. But in this position, white has an extra piece to play on the dark squares. And advancing the f2 pawn to f4 only weakens the dark squares, this diagonal, and the e3 and g3 squares. But Christian Bauer figures that, in any case, he won't be under pressure from his opponent on the dark squares, because he has an extra piece to play on those squares. He has the dark square bishop, of course, but the knight on a 3 can come back to c4 to defend the dark squares. The knight on g1 can come to f3 or e2 to then control the dark squares, whereas the opponent's light-squared bishop will never be able to control the dark squares. That's why he quickly brings the f-pawn into play, which is usually supposed to defend the king in battle. He takes space on the king side. Queen to c7 is played, knight to f3, knight to f6, short castle. And now, what should black do? Of course, they could decide to pin the knight on f3 by playing bishop to g4, but white could simply play h3, and if black exchanges on f3, white recaptures with the queen, and black would ultimately lose the bishop pair while being left with a somewhat weakened pawn structure due to those doubled pawns. Black might also want to castle kingside, But white can launch an attack on the king side with ideas like queen to g1, queen to h4, knight to g5 to put pressure on the h7 pawn, and perhaps drive away the knight on f6 sooner or later by pushing e5. And regarding this e5 push, well, black wants to limit it and will try to play e5 themselves. In the game, they played knight to d7 to be able to play e5. We can't just be satisfied with the e6 push because white could play e5, taking control of the dark squares d6 and f6, with the knight on a3, possibly coming back to c4 to specifically try to play on that d6 square. So in this position, black will look to play e5. Queen e1, the queen makes a small sidestep to move to the king side via the h4 square, short castle, queen h4 as planned, and the e5 push. Here Christian Bauer is not going to wake up the black pieces by capturing on e5. No, he prefers to push f5, continue to gain space, and bring the action against the black king. Notice that for now, the knight on a3 is not in play, but it could quickly come back into the game via the c4 square. And this knight on a3 is going to be decisive in the game. And the maneuvers it will perform are going to be completely surprising, bewildering, but let's be patient. Queen d8 is played, offering a queen exchange. Here, Christian Bauer is not going to play bishop g5 immediately. He will first capture on g6, because if black takes the queen, there would be a capture on f7 with check before recapturing the queen, and in the end, white would win a pawn. So black must recapture on g6 first if they want to maintain material balance. But with which pawn? The problem is, if they recapture with the h7 pawn on g6, there will be knight to g5 with the threat of queen to h7 mate, since if the black knight tries to return to f6, it will be eliminated by the rook. So in reality, black doesn't really have a choice. They will recapture with the f7 pawn on g6. Bishop to g5 is played, queen to e8, and knight to c4. There it is, the knight is back in the game, and look, all of a sudden, it has a lot of possibilities. In fact, black plays b5, trying to destabilize it right away, to push it back. And now the knight that was on a 3 and came to c4, in the end, has many possibilities. Will it jump into d6 to attack the queen? Right now it was attacking e5, but it can also come back to e3, then to g4 to look for possible entries on f6 or h6. But it can also go to a 5. And it's this square that Christian Bauer chooses. She plays knight to a5 to attack the c6 pawn, and look at how the white knight weaves its way around. It went to a 3 to come to c4, now to a 5 to attack c6, and it's not over yet. You'll be surprised again by this knight's maneuvers. So, in this position, queen to e6 was played to defend the c6 pawn from the side, bishop to e7. Actually, it's more to free up the g5 square for the knight than to really attack the rook. The idea for white, of course, is to play knight to g5, attack the queen, and threaten queen takes h7, checkmate, since the knight will protect the queen by taking away the escape square f7. So black finds a defensive move. They play bishop to f6 to counterattack the queen and control the g5 square. So bishop takes f6, knight recaptures on f6, queen to g3, attacking the e5 pawn, and look at how the light squared bishop looks rather useless. All this time, it hasn't been playing. Black still has their light squared bishop. White got rid of theirs very early in the opening, but the light squared bishop just can't find a way to be active in this position. Knight to d7 is played to protect the c5 pawn. Knight to g5, attacking the queen, which moves to d6, and the rooks are exchanged. Here, Christian Bauer takes advantage of the fact that black hasn't finished developing, and the black rooks aren't connected. So the knight recaptures. Rook to the end, all the white pieces are attacking, going all out. Bishop to e6 is played. Pawn to c3, so white pawn to c3. First, there's a little trap. If black takes the pawn on a2, then b3 will follow, since the knight protects this pawn, and the bishop will have trouble getting back home. The move c3 is also to prevent the black queen from exploiting the d4 square with check at some point. Black plays rook to e8 and queen to f2. This way, queen to d4 is not possible, and we start putting pressure on the c5 pawn. And the black queen is overloaded. She has to defend c5, even if for now the pawn isn't attacked, she still has to defend c5. But the bishop is also under attack, and there is pressure on the file as well. It seems to hold for black, but only just. the knight comes to d7, and now the knight to a5. Remember, it went to a3, then c4, then a5. Well, now it's going to b7. It's quite amusing how it climbs up the position, how it advances. Now it's practically at the very top of black's position, and it's attacking the queen as well as the pawn on c5, which is also attacked twice. The black queen moves to e7. As a result, the black queen cuts off the rook's defense of the bishop, and the black queen is overloaded, having to defend both the bishop and the c5 pawn. And that's why Christian Bauer is going to exchange his knight on g5 for the light-squared bishop, in order to then win the c5 pawn. And finally, the knight that went to a3, then c4, then a5, then b7, ends up winning material. It's that knight that provides the material gain, allowing the pawn to be captured. Knight takes c5, queen takes c5. Now the white queen attacks a5, putting pressure on c6 and e5. Black decides to play a5, a4. If taken, the a5 pawn will be captured, and black's pawn structure will be fragmented. Queen to d7 is played to counterattack on d3. h3, giving a small escape square. Capture on a4, queen to c4 check, king to g7, queen takes a4, queen takes d3, queen takes c6, attacking the rook. The queen returns to defend on d8, king to h2, king to h6. The kings are trying to find a little safe square, a bit of protection. The white queen moves to c5, the black queen moves to d3, rook to f7. Here, the black king is deprived of escape squares, and we start putting pressure on h7. Queen takes e4, queen to c7, this attacks a5, but more importantly, and above all, the h7 pawn, so rook to h8, the black rook becomes passive and defensive. And now, white can capture on a5, gaining two connected pass pawns on the queen side. But above all, the problem is the black king and the black rook, which aren't playing. The black king doesn't have a very good shelter, and the black rook is very passive. So the king comes to g5, queen to c5 is played, pawn to h5, queen to f2, and here black is going to play a surprising move. They play rook to g8, but we'll understand this move in a moment. But before explaining rook to g8, let's look at how the game ended with queen to d2, check. And here black resigns because the only way in the end not to get checkmated would be to put the queen on f4, but the rook will take the queen, because if the king goes to h4, that would be checkmate by the pawn on g3. Now I'm going to try to explain why black played rook to g8. I think black wanted to play king to h6 before white played queen to d2. But if king to h6 is played immediately, there will be queen to d2 check to avoid losing the queen on f4 because the rook would take it. So in the end, you're forced to push the pawn, but after pushing the pawn, rook to f6, check. If you bring the queen back, you lose the queen. If you go to g7, there would be queen takes g5, check, leading to a quick mate. And if the king goes to h7, there will be queen to d7, and ultimately, the offensive collaboration between the queen and the rook will also allow for a quick mate. That's why I think in this position, black played rook to g8, because they wanted to play king to h6, and in case of queen to d2 check, be able to play g5, and in case of rook to f6 check, be able to block with a rook on g6. But they don't have time for that, because after rook to g8, queen to d2, and here they're forced to put the queen and they lose the queen, or as I mentioned, king to h4 and g3 is mate. So I found this game very amusing with a knight's journey. Knight to a3, c4, a5, b7, to finally capture the c5 pawn. And it's funny because the knight moved to a3 just after black played the pawn to c5. And it's the knight on a3 that will end up capturing this pawn. No one could have predicted such a story, such a destiny for the white steed. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Tomorrow we'll continue following the Plagne tournament with a new game that I hope will be just as interesting and entertaining. I wish you a pleasant rest of your day. You can leave me likes, comments, and share the video. Goodbye everyone.